Before you watch this incredible story about family secrets and hidden truths, hit that like button right now and subscribe so you never miss these shocking moments that will leave you absolutely speechless. This story will change how you think about family forever. Don't miss it. It was Christmas dinner at the family home, and everyone was gathered around the large oak table. My wife Sarah, her parents, her brother James, James's girlfriend Nicole, and Sarah's elderly grandmother Margaret. The house smelled like turkey and cinnamon. The fire was crackling in the fireplace. It looked like the perfect family holiday moment. But underneath the surface, something dangerous was happening. Sarah's father, Richard, was pouring glass after glass of expensive wine for Margaret, her elderly mother. Margaret had a known problem. She suffered from severe arthritis and took powerful pain medication. She'd been told by her doctors many times, never mix alcohol with her medication. I watched Richard pour her a fourth glass. "Richard, stop," I said quietly. "You know Margaret can't drink with her medication." Richard looked at me with contempt. "I know what my own mother can handle," he said coldly. "Don't tell me how to treat my family." He poured Margaret another glass. I tried again. "Richard, please. This is dangerous. Margaret's been told." "Enough," Richard said, cutting me off sharply. "Stop meddling in family business. You're not part of this family, you're married into it. Know your place." The table fell silent. Everyone was uncomfortable. Margaret looked confused and embarrassed. Sarah was staring down at her plate. Nobody said anything. Richard raised his glass in a toast. "To family," he said, smiling like nothing had happened. But I couldn't stay quiet anymore. What I said next would explode through that family like a bomb, exposing secrets that had been hidden for decades and changing the entire family structure forever. To understand why I couldn't stay silent, you need to know the real story behind this family and what had been happening for years. My name is Michael Chen. I'm 36 years old, and I've been married to Sarah for 8 years. I'm an emergency room doctor at a major hospital. I've spent my entire career learning how to recognize when people are in danger. I've learned to trust my instincts about medical situations. And my instincts were screaming that something very wrong was happening at this table. Sarah's father, Richard, was 68 years old. He was a successful businessman who'd built a real estate empire. He was wealthy, powerful, and accustomed to getting his way. He had a reputation in the family as a generous man who helped everyone financially. But I'd noticed something over the years. I'd watched him use that generosity as leverage. He would loan money to family members and then hold it over their heads. He would pay for things and then use it as an excuse to control decisions. He would offer help and then demand gratitude and obedience in return. It was a pattern of subtle manipulation that nobody in the family seemed to recognize. Except me, because I was the outsider, the one who could see things clearly. Sarah's mother, Catherine, was 66 years old. She was a kind woman, but she was completely dependent on Richard. She didn't work. She had no money of her own. She did whatever Richard told her to do. She never contradicted him. She never stood up to him. It took me years to understand why. But eventually, Sarah told me, Richard had always been controlling. He'd always managed her mother's life. Catherine had just accepted it as normal. Margaret, Sarah's grandmother, was 82 years old. She was a brilliant woman who'd been a teacher before she retired. She was still sharp, still intelligent. But she had severe arthritis, and she was on strong pain medication. And I'd noticed something else. Richard was very interested in Margaret's medication schedule. He'd asked her about it multiple times. He'd asked what her medications cost. He'd suggested that maybe she was taking too many pills. More concerning, I'd noticed that whenever Richard visited his mother, he always brought wine. Expensive wine. And he always encouraged Margaret to drink more than she normally would. I'd mentioned this to Sarah once, and she'd dismissed my concerns. "Dad's just being nice to Grandma," she'd said. "He loves her." But I didn't think he was being nice. I thought something darker was happening. The setting asterisked the family home during Christmas dinner. Everyone is together. Everyone is relaxed. Nobody is paying close attention to the warning signs. The conflict asterisk Richard had been manipulating and controlling his family for decades. Nobody had ever directly confronted him about it. His power came from the fact that he controlled the money, and most family members depended on that money to some degree. Sarah's brother James had received a $100,000 loan from Richard to start a business. James knew better than to contradict his father. Sarah and I owned our home, but we'd received a down payment gift from Richard, and he'd never let us forget it. Every time he wanted something from us, he'd remind us of that gift. Even Catherine had no way to leave Richard. She had no job, no savings, no independence. She was trapped by economic dependency. The family was held together not by love, but by financial chains. The stakes asterisk Margaret's health and safety. But also, if I spoke up and told the truth about what I believed was happening, I risked being cut off from the family money. I risked losing relationships. I risked being branded as a troublemaker. But I also knew from my experience as a doctor that if I stayed silent, someone could get seriously hurt. The dinner continued uncomfortably after Richard's rude dismissal of my concern. I watched him pour Margaret a fifth glass of wine. Margaret was starting to slur her words slightly. She kept losing her train of thought when she talked. Her movements were becoming less coordinated. Sarah kept kicking me under the table, a signal that I should drop the subject. Catherine was looking at her plate, pretending not to notice. James was deliberately avoiding looking at me, knowing full well what was happening but choosing not to say anything. Only Margaret's expression had changed. She looked confused and uncomfortable. She didn't understand why she was feeling dizzy. She'd been told her medications might make her drowsy, but this was different. That's when something incredible happened. Margaret suddenly pushed her chair back and stood up. "I feel unwell," she said, her voice clear and loud despite her dizziness. "I'm going to lie down." "Mom, it's Christmas dinner," Richard said, his voice tense in a way I'd never heard before. "Just sit down and relax." "No," Margaret said firmly. "I'm not feeling well." She walked toward the stairs, holding onto furniture for balance. I made a decision in that moment. I was done being polite. I was done going along with the family dynamics. I was done watching someone manipulate an elderly woman's medications and alcohol consumption. I stood up. "Richard, I need to say something, and everyone needs to hear it," I said, my voice calm but firm. Richard looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Sit down, Michael," he said coldly. "This doesn't concern you." "It concerns me when someone I love is being endangered," I said. "It concerns me as a doctor when I see someone deliberately mixing alcohol with medication that shouldn't be mixed with alcohol." The room went absolutely silent. "That's an accusation," Richard said slowly, standing up to face me across the table. "It's an observation," I said. "I've watched you do this for 3 years. Every time you visit your mother, you bring expensive wine. You encourage her to drink. You ask her about her medication. You suggest she's taking too many pills. And then you watch to see how she reacts to the combination." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. Catherine looked shocked. James had gone very pale. "You're disgusting," Richard said, his voice shaking. "You come into this family and presume to understand dynamics you know nothing about." "I understand enough," I said. "I'm an ER doctor. I've seen elderly people in the hospital with complications from drug and alcohol interactions. I've seen what happens when someone deliberately mixes medications and alcohol to try to make an older person confused and dependent." My voice grew stronger. "And that's what you've been doing to Margaret. You've been deliberately creating situations where she becomes confused and dependent because confused, dependent people are easier to control." "That's enough," Richard roared. "You have no right to speak to me like this." "Actually, I do," I said. "Because I have an ethical and legal obligation to protect vulnerable adults from abuse. And what you're doing is elder abuse, Richard. It's abuse dressed up in expensive wine and the language of family concern. But it's abuse." James stood up suddenly, his hands shaking. "Dad, Michael's right," James said, his voice cracking. "I've seen you do this too. With Mom. With Margaret. You use money to control everyone. You use people's dependence on you to manipulate them. I never said anything because I was afraid of losing your support for the business. But I can't stay quiet anymore." Catherine stood up next. "He's right," she whispered. "I've been living with this for 40 years. I've been controlled and manipulated and told what to do. I've never been allowed to have my own money or make my own decisions. I thought it was normal. I thought it was what marriage was supposed to be like." She looked at Richard, and her voice grew stronger. "But it's not. And I'm done. I want to talk to a lawyer. I want to understand my rights. And I want to know how much money I'm entitled to." Richard's face was turning purple. "You're all turning against me," he shouted. "You're all ungrateful. I've given you everything. I've supported you. I've made sure you had everything you needed. You've held it over our heads," Sarah said quietly. She'd also stood up now. "Every gift came with strings attached. Every financial help came with control. I never realized it until Michael pointed it out, but it's true. You've controlled all of us with money. She looked at her father directly. And what you're doing to Grandma is wrong. It's deliberately trying to make her confused and dependent so you can take control of her affairs. I don't know what your plan was. Maybe you were going to get her to change her will or sign things over to you. But it's wrong. And I'm going to help her get a lawyer too. Richard looked around the table at his family, all standing, all united against him. Get out, he said to me, his voice cold and deadly. You're done. You're not welcome here anymore. You're not part of this family. That's fine, I said calmly. But Margaret needs to see a doctor. Tonight. I'm going to check on her, and if I see any sign that she's in medical danger from the combination of alcohol and medication, I'm going to call the police and report what I've witnessed. I walked out of the dining room and headed upstairs to where Margaret was resting. What happened next unfolded over several months and would transform the entire family. That night, I examined Margaret thoroughly. I found that she was relatively okay physically, but she was confused and disoriented in ways that concerned me. I explained to her what I believed had been happening, that her son had been deliberately mixing her alcohol intake with her medication. Margaret's response was heartbreaking. I suspected something was wrong, she said quietly, but I didn't want to believe it. He's my son. I didn't want to accept that he could do something so cruel. The next day, Sarah and her mother Catherine helped Margaret see a lawyer. Margaret documented everything. The pattern of Richard encouraging her to drink, the way he asked questions about her medications, the conversations about her will. Catherine hired a divorce lawyer and began the process of separating from Richard financially and legally. She discovered that Richard had been controlling all her money, taking significant portions for himself, and telling her she didn't have access to funds because she didn't need it. James contacted his own lawyer to review the business loan agreement. He discovered that Richard had structured the loan in a way that gave him indirect control over James's business decisions. But the most significant action came from Margaret. Margaret contacted Adult Protective Services. She reported what had been happening. She gave them detailed accounts of the pattern of behavior. She authorized them to investigate Richard. The investigation revealed something shocking. Richard had been systematically adding Margaret to his power of attorney documents. He'd been gradually positioning himself to take control of her substantial estate. He'd been creating situations where she was confused and medicated so that she would be more compliant with signing documents. Richard's plan had been to eventually take control of Margaret's $2 million estate. That was the goal all along. Criminal charges were filed against Richard for elder abuse and attempted financial exploitation. Civil lawsuits were filed by Catherine for marital assets that had been wrongfully withheld. Sarah joined her grandmother in civil suits against Richard for elder abuse. James sued Richard over the business loan agreement, arguing that it was entered into through fraud and coercion. The media picked up the story. A man's entire family turning against him at Christmas dinner because of elder abuse and financial manipulation made national news. The headlines were devastating. Family turns against wealthy businessman over elder abuse claims, and doctor stands up to protect vulnerable grandmother. Richard tried to fight the charges. He hired expensive lawyers. He claimed it was all misunderstanding. He said his family was turning against him for money. But the evidence was overwhelming. Text messages showed him asking Margaret about her medications. Credit card records showed systematic purchases of expensive wine followed by visits to his mother. Emails showed him discussing with an accountant how to position himself to inherit Margaret's estate quickly. Richard was convicted of elder abuse. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison. The civil cases were settled. Catherine received half of the marital assets, approximately $3 million. Margaret received a judgment for damages for elder abuse. James renegotiated his business loan on fair terms. But the most powerful moment came when Sarah, Catherine, and Margaret held a press conference about what had happened. "We're speaking out because we want other families to recognize these warning signs," Catherine said, her voice shaking but determined. Financial control, isolation from support, creating dependency, using gifts and money as leverage. These are tactics that abusers use. And they don't just happen in relationships between spouses, they happen in families too. Margaret spoke next. "I was an educated woman. I had a career. I was intelligent. And I didn't recognize that my own son was manipulating me because I didn't want to believe it was possible. I'm speaking out because I want other elderly people to know. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is wrong. And reach out for help. Sarah spoke last. My husband recognized what was happening when the rest of us didn't. He was willing to be called a troublemaker. He was willing to risk his relationship with our family. He was willing to stand up because he knew something wrong was happening. And I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful that he loved me and my family enough to do what was right, even when it was hard. 3 years later, the family had completely reorganized itself. Richard was serving his prison sentence. He had no contact with any family members. Catherine had remarried, to a kind man who treated her with respect and supported her choices. She was working part-time as a consultant, rebuilding the career she'd abandoned 40 years ago. She was independent and happy for the first time in decades. Margaret was living with Sarah and me. She was thriving. She was healthy. She was free from Richard's manipulation. She'd reconnected with old friends. She'd started volunteering with a program that helped elderly people recognize and report financial exploitation. James's business was thriving because he was now making his own decisions without Richard's interference. And Sarah and I had used my willingness to speak up as the foundation for a stronger marriage. We talked more openly about concerns. We supported each other in standing up to injustice. But the real impact came from what happened after our story became public. I was contacted by hospitals across the country asking me to give talks about recognizing elder abuse and financial exploitation in families. I worked with Adult Protective Services to develop better training for recognizing these patterns. Catherine and Margaret started a foundation dedicated to elder abuse prevention and support for victims of financial exploitation by family members. Margaret received dozens of letters from elderly people who'd recognized similar patterns in their own families. Some of them reached out to authorities. Some of them sought legal help. Some of them got away from abusive family members. One letter came from a woman named Dorothy, who was 79 years old. I recognized my own situation in your story, Dorothy wrote. My daughter had been gradually taking control of my finances. She'd been mixing my medications with alcohol. She'd been isolating me from friends who might notice. I didn't realize it was abuse until I read your story. I contacted Adult Protective Services. My daughter is now facing charges. I'm reclaiming my independence and my dignity. Thank you for speaking up. Letters like this came in regularly. Dozens of them. Stories from people who'd recognized patterns of abuse in their own families after hearing our story. The real moral asterisk. This story teaches us something profound about family, power, and what it means to truly love someone. I was an outsider in that family. I didn't have deep financial ties to Richard like other family members did. I didn't depend on his money. I didn't have years of conditioning to make me accept his behavior as normal. That outsider perspective allowed me to see what insiders couldn't see. But more importantly, that outsider status was also what made it possible for me to speak up. I had less to lose than the family members who depended on Richard's financial support. Sarah, James, and Catherine were trapped by financial dependency. They'd been conditioned to accept Richard's control. They didn't speak up because they were afraid of losing money, losing support, losing the life they'd built. But when I spoke up, I gave them permission to speak up too. My willingness to take the risk made it possible for them to take the risk. The universal truth asterisk. In situations where someone with power is manipulating or abusing others, silence is not neutral. Silence protects the abuser. Silence allows the abuse to continue. Silence makes you complicit. Speaking up, even when you have something to lose, is the only ethical choice. Speaking up, even when people attack you for it, is what creates the possibility for change. I was called a troublemaker. I was told I didn't understand family dynamics. I was warned that I was risking my marriage and my relationships. And I had to decide, was my comfort more important than Margaret's safety? Was my relationship with Richard more important than Catherine's freedom? Was my place in the family more important than exposing abuse? I decided that those things were not more important. I decided that protecting vulnerable people from abuse was worth the cost. And because I made that decision, everything changed. Not just for my family, but for dozens of other families who recognized similar patterns and got help. For everyone watching this story asterisk, ask yourself, where in your life do you see something wrong but stay silent? Where are you choosing comfort over justice? Where are you allowing someone else's abuse to continue because it's easier than speaking up? Because sometimes being a good person means being willing to be uncomfortable. It means being willing to be called a troublemaker. It means being willing to risk relationships and comfort for the sake of protecting someone else. That's what I did at that Christmas dinner table. And everything changed because of it. Did this story move you? Did it show you the importance of speaking up, even when it's hard, even when you have something to lose? Smash that like button right now and hit subscribe, because stories like this prove that one person's courage to speak truth can protect vulnerable people and inspire systemic change. From recognizing elder abuse to preventing financial exploitation to helping families heal. This is what happens when someone is brave enough to say what needs to be said. You absolutely don't want to miss the next story where someone's willingness to speak up transforms lives. Subscribe now, hit the notification bell, and let's keep celebrating the people who protect the vulnerable and stand up for what's right. Flex biceps, broken heart sparkles.